Picture this. A young conqueror, barely 30 years old, stands at the edge of the known world. Behind him lies the smouldering ruins of the Persian Empire, the greatest superpower in history, crushed under his relentless advance. But ahead of him, across a raging river in the heart of Central Asia, waits an enemy unlike any he has ever faced. They are not soldiers in ranks or armies with supply lines. They are the ghosts of the steppe, mounted archers who can fire backwards at full gallop, warriors who have never been conquered, nomads who vanish into the endless grasslands like smoke. The Scythians have come, and they're bringing a horde that stretches to the horizon. But Alexander the Great is sick, his army exhausted, and his empire is burning behind him in open revolt. This is not another glorious battle. This is survival. Welcome to the Battle of Jaxartes, where Alexander would face his greatest test, not against the armies of kings, but against the fury of the untamed steppe. Before we journey into this incredible tale of tactical brilliance on the frontier of the ancient world, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got more epic battles and forgotten moments from history coming your way, and you definitely don't want to miss them. Now, let's discover how Alexander turned his darkest hour into one of his most spectacular victories. The year was 329 BC, and Alexander the Great stood at what should have been the pinnacle of his achievements. Just 2 years earlier, on the blood-soaked plains of Gaugamela, he had shattered the last great army of the Persian Empire in what many consider the most perfect tactical victory in military history. Darius III, the King of Kings, was dead, murdered by his own nobles in a desperate bid for survival. The legendary cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis had opened their gates to the Macedonian conqueror, and their unimaginable treasuries now funded his campaigns. Alexander had proclaimed himself the legitimate successor to the Persian throne, king of Asia, ruler of an empire that stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to the mountains of Afghanistan. He was not yet 30 years old, and he had already achieved what no Greek had ever dreamed possible. But empire, as Alexander was about to learn in the most brutal way imaginable, is not built in a single battle. Conquest is one thing. Holding what you have conquered is something else entirely. The regions of Sogdiana and Bactria, in what we now call Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and northern Afghanistan, were the wild, untamed northeastern frontier of the Persian Empire. These were not the civilized satrapies of the West, with their ancient cities and established bureaucracies. This was a harsh, mountainous land of fierce warrior cultures, isolated valleys, and proud, independent peoples who had always resented Persian rule, and saw Alexander not as a liberator, but as just another foreign invader. The local population was made up of hardy Iranian peoples, closely related to the Persians themselves but fiercely independent in spirit. They were renowned horsemen and archers, masters of mountain warfare and guerrilla tactics. They had no intention of bowing to this upstart Macedonian king, no matter how many battles he had won in the distant west. Leading Alexander's army into this hostile territory was supposed to be straightforward. The last Persian satrap of Bactria, a nobleman named Bessus, had been one of the conspirators who murdered Darius III in a desperate attempt to win favour with Alexander and save his own skin. It hadn't worked. When Alexander learned of Bessus's treachery, his fury was apocalyptic. Bessus, terrified and realizing he had gained nothing from his betrayal, fled north across the mighty Oxus River into Sogdiana, proclaiming himself the new king of Persia and calling on all the eastern provinces to rise up and resist the Macedonian invader. It was an act of pure desperation, but it found fertile ground among the proud Sogdian nobility who'd been waiting for just such a rallying cry. Alexander, characteristically, would not tolerate this challenge to his authority. He pursued Bessus with the relentless, obsessive determination that had become his trademark. His army crossed the Oxus River, one of the great natural barriers of Central Asia, in a feat of military engineering that stunned even his own veterans. There was no bridge, no fleet. Alexander ordered his men to stuff their leather tent covers with hay and straw, creating thousands of makeshift rafts that ferried his entire army across the wide, treacherous waters in just 5 days. It was an act of improvisation and iron will that demonstrated why his soldiers believed he could accomplish the impossible. Once across, the net closed on Bessus quickly. The would-be usurper found that declaring yourself king of Persia and actually getting people to follow you were two very different things. His own nobles, seeing Alexander's army approaching and recognizing that resistance was futile, betrayed him. They bound him in chains and delivered him to Alexander's camp, hoping for mercy. Alexander showed none. Bessus was subjected to a horrific execution designed to send a message to anyone else who might consider rebellion. He was mutilated, publicly humiliated, and then sent to Ecbatana, the ancient Persian capital, where he was crucified in the traditional Persian manner reserved for traitors and regicides. Justice, in Alexander's view, had been served. With Bessus eliminated, Alexander believed the eastern provinces would accept his rule. He could not have been more wrong. The execution of Bessus did not bring peace. It ignited a firestorm. A Sogdian nobleman named Spitamenes, a brilliant and charismatic warlord who had initially helped capture Bessus, now emerged as the leader of a widespread rebellion. Spitamenes was everything Bessus was not: a natural leader, a master of guerrilla warfare, and a man who understood the geography and peoples of the region intimately. He'd realized that Alexander could not be defeated in open battle. The Macedonian phalanx was simply too powerful, their cavalry too skilled, and their king too brilliant a tactician. But Spitamenes didn't need to defeat Alexander in battle. He just needed to bleed him, to make the occupation so costly, so endless and so exhausting that Alexander would eventually give up and leave. It was one of the first great insurgencies recorded in ancient history, and it nearly worked. In the summer of 329 BC, the rebellion exploded across Sogdiana with stunning coordination and ferocity. 7 fortified cities that Alexander had garrisoned rose up in a single, synchronized uprising. Their Macedonian garrisons, men who thought they were simply administrators in a pacified province, were massacred to the last man in act of shocking brutality. The largest of these cities was Chiropolis, founded 2 centuries earlier by Cyrus the Great himself, and considered one of the jewels of the region. Alexander, enraged by the revolt and determined to make an example that would crush the rebellion before it spread further, personally led the assault on Cyropolis. The siege was brutal and swift. His soldiers, veterans of 100 battles, were in no mood for mercy after the massacre of their comrades. When the walls were finally breached after fierce fighting, the sack was total. Ancient sources report that 8,000 defenders and civilians were slaughtered in a single day of blood and fire. The city that had stood for 2 centuries was razed to the ground, its very stones scattered as a warning. But even this act of terrible vengeance did not end the rebellion. Spitamenes, the ghost of the steppe, remained free, and his forces continued to harass Alexander's supply lines and garrisons. It was in the midst of this crisis, with his empire burning and his authority challenged at its very frontier, that Alexander made a decision that would define the next phase of his campaign. He would not simply react to the rebellion, he would take the war to its source. He marched his army to the very edge of his conquered territory, to the banks of the great Jaxartes River, the natural boundary that the Persians had always recognized as the limit of civilization. Beyond that river lay the endless steppes of Central Asia, the homeland of the Scythian and Saka nomads, the horse peoples who had never bowed to any empire. And there, on the southern bank of that ancient frontier, Alexander founded a new city. He called it Alexandria Eschate, Alexandria the furthest, a deliberate statement that this was the edge of the world, the final boundary of his ambition. It was to be a fortress, a garrison city, a permanent Macedonian presence at the end of the earth. He populated it with Greek mercenaries, wounded veterans, and local volunteers, intending it to serve as a bulwark against the nomadic tribes of the north. But the founding of Alexandria Eschate was not received as a symbol of stability. To the Scythian and Saka tribes who roamed the vast grasslands beyond the river, it was provocation, an act of aggression, a foreign fortress on their very doorstep. These were not subjects of the Persian Empire. They were free peoples who recognized no king. And now, while Alexander was busy constructing his city and trying to suppress the Sogdian revolt, word came that a massive Saka army, thousands of mounted archers led by their tribal chieftains, had gathered on the northern bank of the Jaxartes. They were not there to negotiate. They had come to drive the invaders back, to test this foreign king who claimed to be invincible. They issued a challenge that echoed across the river. If Alexander dared to cross, they would teach him that the steppe could not be conquered. We are about to witness one of Alexander's most ingenious tactical performances, using artillery to cover a river crossing against horse archers. But briefly, bringing you these stories from the far frontiers of the ancient world requires accessing sources from all over the globe, and I want to do that securely. I use NordVPN to protect my personal data and browse privately. It is a tool I trust to keep my digital life safe. If you want to secure your online privacy and support the channel at the same time, check the link in the description or the pinned comment for an exclusive deal. Now, let's see how Alexander responded to the greatest challenge of his career. The Macedonian king found himself in a strategic nightmare, the kind of multi-front crisis that has destroyed countless commanders throughout history. On one side of the river, he had the Sogdian revolt led by the brilliant and elusive Scythians, a guerrilla war that was bleeding his army through ambushes, raids, and the constant threat to his supply lines. On the other side of the river, the Saka nomads had assembled in their thousands, mounted archers whose reputation for ferocity and skill was legendary throughout the ancient world. They taunted him daily from across the water, their war cries echoing across the river, daring him to cross and face them on the open steppe, where their mobility would be an overwhelming advantage. To make matters infinitely worse, Alexander himself was seriously ill. The ancient sources, particularly the historian Arrian, report that Alexander had contracted a severe case of dysentery, the curse of ancient armies. This was not a minor inconvenience. Dysentery in the ancient world was a killer, a disease that could fell the strongest warrior in days through dehydration, fever, and utter physical exhaustion. Alexander was suffering from violent fever, racking abdominal pain, and the complete inability to keep down food or water. His legendary physical strength, the vitality that had allowed him to lead, charges from the front and fight hand-to-hand in the thick of battle was draining away. His physicians, the best in the ancient world, were desperately trying to treat him, but their herbal remedies and bloodletting techniques could only do so much. The king was confined to his tent. barely able to stand, while his empire teetered on the edge of collapse around him. His generals, the grizzled Macedonian veterans who had followed him from Greece to the edge of the known world, were in a state of barely concealed panic. Parmenion was long dead, executed on Alexander's orders in a purge of perceived disloyalty, a decision that still haunted the army. The command structure now fell to men like Craterus, Hephaestion, and Ptolemy, capable commanders but lacking the overall strategic vision of their king. They gathered in urgent councils of war, debating their options, all of which looked grim. They could retreat back across the Oxus, abandoning the newly founded Alexandria Eschati and admitting defeat to both Spitamenes and the Seca. Such a retreat would be seen as a catastrophic loss of prestige, would embolden every rebel in the empire, and might very well spark a general uprising that could cost Alexander everything he had conquered. Or they could stay, hunker down in their fortifications, and wait for the king to either recover or die. But staying meant accepting the Saka challenge to do nothing, an act of cowardice that would destroy the Macedonian army's morale and reputation. Then, in the midst of this crisis, devastating news arrived from the west. Spitamenes, the ghost who could not be caught, had laid siege to Maracanda, modern-day Samarkand, one of the most important cities in Sogdiana and a key Macedonian garrison. The city's defenders were in desperate straits, facing annihilation. Alexander, despite his illness, despite barely being able to sit upright in his bed, immediately dispatched a relief force. It was a substantial army, over 2,000 men, a mix of Macedonian infantry and Greek mercenary cavalry, commanded by an officer named Pharnuches. Alexander's orders were clear: march to Maracanda, relieve the siege, and destroy Spitamenes. It should have been a straightforward mission. It turned into one of the worst disasters of Alexander's entire career. Spitamenes, informed of the approaching Macedonian relief force, did exactly what he did best. He lifted the siege of Maracanda and melted away into the countryside, drawing the pursuing Macedonians further and further from their base, deeper into hostile territory. Pharnuches, eager for glory and confident in the superiority of Macedonian arms, fell for the trap completely. He pursued relentlessly, ignoring the warnings of his scouts about the terrain and the enemy's intentions. Spitamenes led him to the banks of the Zarafshan River, a place where the open ground favoured cavalry, and then turned and sprang his trap. The Macedonian force, suddenly surrounded by thousands of Scythian, mounted archers fighting alongside Spitamenes' Sogdian cavalry, found itself in a horrific killing ground. The mounted archers, masters of the Parthian shot, rode in endless circles around the increasingly desperate Macedonian formation, pouring arrows into them from a distance, never closing to where the Macedonian infantry could bring their sarissas to bear. It was a massacre. The Macedonians, designed to fight in disciplined formations against enemies who would meet them shield to shield, were helpless against this tactic. They tried to form square, tried to retreat in order, but the cavalry stayed with them, harassing them every step of the way, cutting down any man who fell out of formation. Exhausted, thirsty, and bleeding from 1,000 arrow wounds, the Macedonian force was systematically annihilated. Of the 2,000 men who had marched out so confidently, fewer than 300 survived to stagger back to friendly lines with the news. Pharnuches and all of his senior officers were dead. It was the worst defeat a Macedonian army had suffered in Alexander's entire reign, a catastrophe that sent shockwaves through the entire army. The men began to whisper that perhaps the king had finally met his match, that perhaps the steppe could not be conquered after all. When the news of the disaster reached Alexander's sickbed, the effect was galvanizing. The ancient sources tell us that his reaction was immediate and visceral. Despite his illness, despite his physicians literally begging him to stay in bed, he rose, fueled by a combination of rage at the defeat, determination to avenge his fallen soldiers, and the sheer force of will that had driven him his entire life. Alexander demanded his armor. His body might have been racked with fever, his stomach unable to hold food, but his mind was clear and his purpose absolute. He would not lie in bed while his empire burned. He would not show weakness to enemies who believed he was finished. He had two threats to deal with, and he would deal with them both, no matter the cost to his own health. Alexander made a decision that stunned his generals and demonstrated the kind of ruthless prioritization that separated him from ordinary commanders. He would divide his forces, a move that every military manual warns against, but that Alexander had successfully executed multiple times. He would personally lead a lightning strike south to relieve Maracanda and confront Spitamenes, while leaving Craterus and a holding force to monitor the Saka across the river. It was an enormous gamble. If the Saka chose to cross while he was away, Craterus's force might not be enough to stop them. But Alexander understood something fundamental about leadership and morale. His men needed to see him act, to see him take the offensive even in his weakened state, to know that their king had not been broken by illness or defeat. The march to Maracanda was the stuff of legend, a feat of endurance that his soldiers would talk about for the rest of their lives. Alexander, still suffering from dysentery, still running a fever, drove his army across 170 miles of brutal mountainous terrain in just 3 days and 4 nights. It was an almost superhuman pace, achieved through forced marches with minimal rest, the men sleeping in their armor, eating on the move, driven forward by the knowledge that their king, sick as he was riding at their head and would accept no excuses. When they arrived at Maracanda, they found that Spitamenes, once again demonstrating his genius for guerrilla warfare, had already fled. He had no intention of facing Alexander in open battle. He vanished into the vast countryside, leaving Alexander with a relieved garrison but no enemy to fight. Alexander, frustrated but recognizing that chasing Spitamenes across Sogdiana would be a waste of time and energy, made another crucial decision. He would deal with Spitamenes later, through a campaign of relentless pressure and pursuit that would eventually force the warlord's own allies to betray him. But first, he had to deal with the more immediate threat, the one that was visible and waiting for him, the Saka army on the Jaxartes. He turned his exhausted army around and marched them back north, covering the same brutal 170 miles, returning to Alexandria Eshati and the riverbank, ready at last to settle accounts with the Saka across the water. The Saka people, whom the Greeks called Scythians, were one of the great mysteries and terrors of the ancient world. They were not a single unified nation, but rather a confederation of nomadic tribes that roamed the vast steppes of Central Asia, from the shores of the Black Sea to the borders of China. They lived their entire lives on horseback, following their herds of horses and sheep across thousands of miles of grassland, their entire society designed around mobility and warfare. They had no cities, no farms, no fixed settlements that an enemy could attack or conquer. They were the wind itself, impossible to pin down, impossible to defeat through conventional military means. What made the Saka truly terrifying to settled civilizations was their mastery of mounted archery, a skill they learned from childhood. A Saka warrior could ride at full gallop, his horse trained to respond to knee commands alone, leaving both hands free to wield his powerful composite bow. These bows, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, were technological marvels that could punch an arrow through armor at 100 yards. But the most famous succor tactic, the one that had defeated countless armies over the centuries, was the Parthian shot. A succor rider, seemingly retreating in panic, would twist in his saddle and fire backwards at his pursuing enemies with devastating accuracy. It was a tactic that turned retreat into ambush, that lured overconfident enemies to their deaths, and that had humiliated every army that had tried to fight them on the open steppe. Steppe peoples like the Saka had never been fully subdued by any empire. Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, the man who had defeated the Babylonians, the Lydians, and a dozen other nations, had died in a disastrous campaign against the Massagetæ, a steppe people akin to the Saka world. According to legend, a steppe queen named Tomyris, ruler of the Massagetæ, had defeated Cyrus's army, killed him in battle, and then dropped his severed head into a skin filled with blood, saying, "Drink your fill of blood now." Darius I, one of the greatest Persian emperors, had campaigned against the European Scythians and been forced to retreat after they employed scorched earth tactics, burning their own lands to deny him supplies and harassing his army with constant raids until he was forced to abandon the campaign in frustration. These were not stories lost on Alexander. He knew the history. He knew what he was facing. The Saka force that had gathered on the northern bank of the Jaxartes numbered in the thousands, perhaps as many as 15,000 mounted warriors, according to some ancient estimates. They were not an organized army in the Macedonian sense. There were no supply trains, no heavy infantry, no siege engines. Just thousands of expert horsemen, each one a warrior from birth, armed with powerful bows and deadly skill, led by their tribal chieftains. They had come in response to the founding of Alexandria Esha, seeing it as a threat to their traditional grazing lands and their independence. But they had also come because of Alexander's reputation. Here was a king who claimed to be invincible, who defeated the mighty Persians, who ruled half the known world. The Saka wanted to test him, to prove that the steppe was different, that their way of war could defeat even the great Alexander. From the southern bank, Alexander's scouts observed the Saka army with growing concern. The nomads were not hiding their numbers. They wanted to be seen. They rode their horses along the far bank in elaborate displays of horsemanship, showing off their skills, firing arrows across the water that fell short but made their point. They shouted challenges and insults across the river in their own languages, daring the Macedonians to cross. At night, their campfires lit up the northern horizon like a field of stars, a visible reminder of their overwhelming numbers. To the Macedonian soldiers, many of whom had never seen mounted archers in action and didn't understand the tactics they employed, the Saka seemed like demons, supernatural warriors who could strike from anywhere and vanish like ghosts. Alexander knew that conventional tactics would not work. The Saka would never allow themselves to be pinned down in a traditional battle. If he crossed the river and tried to pursue them on the open steppe, they would simply retreat, drawing his army further and further from its base, harassing him constantly with hit-and-run attacks, bleeding his forces through attrition until he was forced to retreat in exhaustion, just as they had done to Darius and Cyrus. And yet, he could not ignore them. To refuse their challenge would be to appear weak, to give credence to the whispers that Alexander had met an enemy he couldn't defeat. His reputation, the mystique of invincibility that was one of his greatest weapons, demanded that he respond. Alexander recovered enough from his illness to sit a horse and think clearly, gathered his commanders and laid out a plan that was audacious even by his standards. He would accept the Saka challenge. He would cross the Jaxartes and give battle, but he would do it on his terms, not theirs. He would not chase them into the steppe. He would lure them into a battle on ground of his choosing, using tactics and weapons they had never encountered, turning their own aggressive confidence against them. It was a plan that relied on perfect timing, iron discipline, and technological surprise. In short, it was classically Alexandrian. The first step was crossing the river itself, and this presented an enormous tactical problem. The Jaxartes, known today as the Scythian, was a major river, wide and fast-flowing in the late summer. There was no bridge, no ford, no easy crossing point. Any attempt to cross would leave his forces vulnerable at their most exposed moment, caught in the water, unable to fight effectively, perfect targets for the Saka-mounted archers waiting on the far bank. A conventional crossing would be a bloodbath, but Alexander had an advantage that the Saka didn't know about and couldn't counter: siege artillery. His army carried with it a sophisticated engineering corps, a legacy of his father Philip's military reforms. Among their equipment were torsion catapults and siege bows, powerful machines originally designed for sieges, capable of hurling large bolts and stones with tremendous force over long distances. Alexander ordered every catapult and siege bow he had to be brought forward and positioned along the southern bank of the river, directly opposite the main Saka concentration. These were weapons the nomads had never seen, had never even imagined. To them, bows were hand weapons. The idea of a giant mechanical bow that could shoot a spear-sized bolt 600 yards was beyond their comprehension. Alexander was about to give them a demonstration they would never forget. The second part of the plan was the crossing itself. Alexander couldn't build a bridge under fire, but he didn't need to. He ordered his men to collect every piece of leather they could find in the camp, every tent cover, every water skin, every piece of horse tack. These leather pieces were stuffed with dry grass and hay, sewn shut to create airtight flotation devices, and lashed together to form rafts. It was the same technique he had used to cross the Oxus, a makeshift fleet that could be assembled quickly and would allow his entire army to cross at multiple points simultaneously. The Saka would have too many targets to concentrate their fire effectively. The third and most crucial element was the battle plan for once he reached the far shore. Alexander knew the Saka's primary tactic. They would keep their distance, circle his formation, and shoot it to pieces with arrows, never closing to where his infantry could engage them. Therefore, he needed to force them into close combat to negate their mobility and bring them into range where his superior armour and discipline would tell. He devised a complex combined arms tactic that would use his cavalry as bait, his infantry as an anvil, and his archers as a net to trap the enemy. It was a plan that required his men to trust him completely, to execute complex maneuvers while under fire, and to hold their nerve in the face of an enemy that would appear to be everywhere at once. On the morning of the battle, Alexander addressed his troops. The ancient historians don't record the exact words he spoke, but they tell us that he invoked the memory of the disaster at the Zeravshan, reminded his men of their fallen comrades who needed to be avenged, and assured them that the Saka, for all their reputation, were just men on horses, and men could be beaten. More importantly, he was seen. The soldiers saw their king, still pale from his illness, but standing upright, armoured and ready to lead them from the front as he always had. The whispers about his weakness, about him being broken, evaporated. Alexander was back, and that simple fact did more for morale than any speech could have accomplished. At his signal, the catapults and siege bows opened fire. The Saka warriors gathered confidently on the far bank, expecting to slaughter the Macedonians as they struggled ashore, suddenly found themselves under a bombardment unlike anything they had ever experienced. The large bolts from the siege bows, each one the size of a javelin, came screaming across the river with terrifying velocity and accuracy. The range was extraordinary, far beyond what any hand bow could achieve. One of the first bolts struck a Saka chieftain, identifiable by his elaborate horse trappings and golden talk, killing him instantly and sending his body tumbling from his horse. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. The Saka, who had never faced artillery, were utterly unprepared for this kind of warfare. They had expected bows and spears, weapons they understood, weapons they could counter with their own superior archery and mobility. But these giant machines were death at a distance, impersonal and unstoppable. Men and horses fell under the barrage, and the survivors, their confidence shaken, began to pull back from the riverbank, moving out of range of these terrifying weapons. It was exactly what Alexander had hoped for. The far bank was now clear, and the crossing could begin. At a trumpet blast, the entire Macedonian army launched their leather rafts into the water simultaneously at multiple points along the river. It was a scene of controlled chaos. Thousands of men pushing off from the shore, paddling frantically, the current carrying some of them downstream, but the sheer number of crossings overwhelming any ability the Saka had to concentrate their fire. The Saka mounted archers, recovered from their shock, rowed back toward the bank and began firing at the rafts. But there were too many targets. The catapults continued their bombardment, forcing the Saka to keep moving, denying them the chance to set up stable firing positions. The first troops to reach the far shore were Alexander's archers and light infantry, Agrianians and Cretan bowmen, men whose job was to establish a defensive perimeter and cover the landing of the heavier forces. They splashed ashore, formed into loose skirmish lines, and immediately began returning fire at the circling Saka. It was bow against bow, the Cretan archers' skill against the Saka's legendary marksmanship. The difference was that the Macedonian archers were on foot, stationary, and able to aim carefully, while the Saka were firing from horseback at moving targets. The exchange was roughly even, but it bought time. Behind the archers came the cavalry, Alexander's companion cavalry, and the Thessalian horse, the elite mounted arm of his army. They were not as numerous as the Saka, perhaps 2,000 riders against 15,000, but they were heavily armoured, riding larger war horses bred for shock combat, and armed with the long Xyston lance designed for charging. They formed up on the beach, shaking water from their armour, their horses snorting and pawing the ground, ready for the fight. And finally came the phalanx, the heavy infantry, wading ashore with their 18-foot sarissas held high to keep them out of the water, forming into their deadly formations on the far bank. The Saka, seeing the entire Macedonian army now on their side of the river, prepared for battle, but they were still confident. They had the numbers, they had the mobility, and they were on their home terrain. They began to implement their traditional tactic, spreading out into a vast semicircle that threatened to envelop the Macedonian force, keeping their distance, preparing to ride in circles and shoot the invaders to pieces. It was the tactic that had destroyed armies for centuries. Alexander was about to show them why it wouldn't work this time. Alexander, mounted on Bucephalus and clearly visible at the head of his companion cavalry, led the first move. But instead of ordering a general advance, instead of trying to close with the entire Saka army, he did something the nomads didn't expect. he ordered a portion of his cavalry, perhaps 500 riders, to charge forward aggressively, directly at one section of the Saka line, isolating a portion of their force. This flying wedge of heavy cavalry crashed forward, lances levelled, not in a probing attack but in what appeared to be an all-out desperate charge. The Saka warriors, seeing a relatively small force of cavalry charging at them in what looked like suicidal recklessness, did exactly what their instincts and training told them to do. They surrounded the charging Macedonians, using their superior numbers and mobility to envelop this rash detachment, intending to annihilate it with concentrated arrow fire. It looked like a massacre in the making. The Macedonian cavalry, seemingly trapped and isolated, was suddenly surrounded by thousands of circling Saka archers. But this was exactly what Alexander wanted. The moment the Saka committed to surrounding his cavalry, the moment they fixed themselves in place and focused all their attention on this single target, Alexander sprung his trap. He'd been waiting for this exact moment, for the enemy to lose their mobility advantage by focusing on a single point. At his signal, the Macedonian infantry, which had been advancing in a disciplined line, suddenly surged forward at the double. The phalanx, that unstoppable forest of pikes, crashed into the side of the Saka encirclement. At the same time, the Agrianians and Cretan archers, advancing on a broad front, closed in from another angle, creating a net of interlocking fire. The Saka suddenly found themselves in a nightmare scenario. They had committed to destroying the surrounded cavalry, which meant they had dismounted mentally from their hit-and-run tactics, and were now engaged in a static fight. But the Macedonian infantry was now upon them, and infantry was death to light cavalry. The sarissas, those 18-foot pikes, had enormous reach. A Saka rider, even on horseback, couldn't get close enough to use his sword without being impaled by 3 or 4 pike points. The Saka's advantage had always been their ability to stay at range, to refuse close combat. That option was now gone. The surrounded Macedonian cavalry, far from being destroyed, had been bait in a perfectly executed trap. Now reinforced by infantry and supported by massed archery, they turned from prey to predator. The battle devolved into a desperate swirling melee. The Saka, caught between the anvil of the phalanx and the hammer of the cavalry, and harassed by constant archery fire, tried to break free. Some succeeded, using their superior horsemanship to slip through gaps in the Macedonian line and gallop away to safety. But many didn't. The casualties began to mount. Alexander, seeing the Saka formation beginning to crack, personally led a charge of his elite companions directly at what appeared to be the main body of Saka chieftains, identifiable by their elaborate armour and the standards they carried. This was classical Alexandrian tactics: strike at the head. If he could kill or scatter the leaders, the rest would lose cohesion. The charge was devastating. The companions, the finest heavy cavalry in the world, smashed into the Saka leadership group like a thunderbolt. The Xyston lances, 12 feet of ashwood tipped with iron, outreached anything the Saka could bring to bear in close combat. Chieftains fell, their bodyguards scattered, and the psychological centre of the Saka army began to disintegrate. The Saka, realizing that this battle was not going as planned, that they were losing warriors at an alarming rate, and that their tactical advantages had been nullified, made the decision that nomadic armies had always made when faced with unacceptable losses. They disengaged. Using their superior speed, the surviving Saka warriors broke contact, wheeling their horses away from the Macedonian trap, and galloped off into the open steppe. It was not a panicked rout. It was an organised retreat, a tactical withdrawal. but it was still a retreat, and it meant the battle was over. Alexander, demonstrating the tactical wisdom that separated him from glory-seeking fools, did not pursue. He understood the fundamental lesson that Cyrus and Darius had ignored. You cannot chase nomads into the steppe and win. They would simply lead him further and further from his base, scatter his forces, and turn retreat into ambush. He had accomplished his objective. He had met the Saka in battle, on ground of his choosing, had inflicted significant casualties, and had driven them from the field. More importantly, he had won a psychological victory. The Saka, the unconquerable nomads of the steppe, had challenged Alexander and lost. That message would echo across Central Asia. The casualties of the Battle of Jaxartes tell the story of a tactically perfect victory. Ancient sources suggest the Saka lost over 1,000 warriors killed, including several prominent chieftains, a devastating blow to a nomadic society where every warrior was valuable and leaders were irreplaceable. Macedonian losses were moderate compared to the enemy, roughly a couple hundred killed and about 1,000 wounded, a testament to Alexander's brilliant use of combined arms and the superiority of his heavily armoured troops in close combat. The disparity was striking, and sent exactly the message Alexander intended. Challenging Macedon was fatal. But what happened after the battle was perhaps even more significant than the battle itself. In the aftermath, the remaining Saka chieftains, seeing their defeat and recognizing that continued resistance would only bring more death, sent envoys to Alexander's camp. They came expecting harsh terms, enslavement or execution, as was the custom in the brutal warfare of the ancient world. Alexander shocked them by offering generous peace terms. Not only did he agree to peace, but he released all of the Saka prisoners he had taken without ransom, an act of stunning generosity in an age when prisoners were routinely sold into slavery or held for enormous sums. This was not simply kindness, it was brilliant strategic psychology. Alexander understood something that many conquerors never learn. Fear can secure temporary submission, but respect can win lasting peace. The Saka were not a people who could be permanently conquered or garrisoned. Their way of life, their mobility, made traditional occupation impossible. But they were a people who valued honour and respected strength. By defeating them in fair combat and then showing mercy and victory, Alexander earned something far more valuable than their submission. He earned their respect. The released prisoners returned to their tribes with stories not of a cruel tyrant, but of a warrior king who fought bravely and treated his enemies with honour. The result was that the Saka tribes, for the remainder of Alexander's campaigns in Central Asia, remained peaceful. Some even allied with him, providing him with valuable scouts and intelligence about the region. It was a masterclass in how to win not just battles, but hearts and minds. With the Saka threat neutralized, Alexander turned his full attention back to the Sogdian revolt and the elusive Spitamenes. What followed was a brutal, grinding campaign that would last another 2 years. It was a campaign of sieges, of mountain fortresses taken by impossible assaults, of relentless pursuit through hostile terrain. Spitamenes continued to harass Macedonian forces with guerrilla tactics, but Alexander's response was systematic and remorseless. He garrisoned every major city, built a network of fortresses and supply depots, and pursued the rebel warlord relentlessly with mobile columns that gave him no rest and no safe haven. Eventually, in late 328 BC, Spitamenes' luck ran out. Defeated in a battle by Alexander's general Coenus, abandoned by his allies who were exhausted by the endless war, Spitamenes was betrayed by his own men. The Massagetæ nomads, his last remaining allies, killed him and sent his severed head to Alexander as a peace offering. It was a grim end for a brilliant commander, but it marked the effective end of the Sogdian revolt. The last major fortresses, the seemingly impregnable Sogdian Rock and the Rock of Chorians, fell to Alexander's forces through a combination of siege warfare and audacious mountain climbing that remains legendary to this day. By 327 BC, Sogdiana was finally pacified, and Alexander could turn his attention to his next great adventure, the invasion of India. The Battle of Jaxartes stands as one of Alexander the Great's most impressive tactical victories, not because of its scale, which was modest compared to Gaugamela or Issus, but because of the circumstances under which it was fought and the manner in which it was won. Alexander, physically weakened by illness, strategically pressured by revolt, and psychologically tested by the worst defeat his army had suffered, responded not with caution, but with audacity. He crossed a major river under fire, engaged an enemy whose tactics had defeated the greatest kings in history, and neutralized their advantages through tactical innovation and combined arms coordination. It was a masterclass in how to fight an asymmetric war against a mobile, unconventional enemy. The battle demonstrated several of Alexander's greatest qualities as a commander. First was his ability to analyze an enemy's tactics and develop counters that turned their strengths into weaknesses. The Cerca's mobility and archery, which had been their decisive advantages for centuries, were rendered irrelevant once Alexander lured them into close combat using his cavalry as bait and his infantry as the killing blow. Second was his willingness to employ technological superiority without shame or hesitation. The use of siege artillery to cover a river crossing was unprecedented, a creative application of siege equipment to a battlefield problem that gave him a crucial edge. Third, and perhaps most importantly, was his understanding that winning battles was not enough. His merciful treatment of the defeated Sarka, so contrary to the brutal norms of ancient warfare, secured a lasting peace on his northern frontier and freed him to deal with the Sogdian revolt without worrying about his rear. The founding of Alexandria Eschate, the city that had sparked the Saka challenge, survived and prospered. It stood for centuries as a symbol of the furthest reach of Greek civilization, a cosmopolitan trading city where Greek, Persian and nomadic cultures mingled and influenced each other. It was one of dozens of cities Alexander founded across his empire, urban seeds that spread Hellenistic culture across Asia and created the interconnected world of the Hellenistic age. The battle had secured not just a military victory but the foundation for centuries of cultural exchange. For Alexander personally, the campaign in Sogdiana and the Battle of Jaxartes marked a turning point. These were not the glorious, decisive battles against the massed armies of the Persian Empire. This was brutal, grinding counterinsurgency warfare, a test of endurance and will rather than tactical brilliance in a single afternoon. It cost him more time, more casualties, and more frustration than all his Western campaigns combined. But it also proved that his genius extended beyond the set-piece battle, that he could adapt to any form of warfare and emerge victorious. When he finally left Central Asia in 327 BC, marching his army toward India, he left behind not conquered subjects held down by fear, but a secured frontier, pacified cities, and peoples who had learned that Alexander could be both a terrifying enemy and a magnanimous victor. The Battle of Jaxartes reminds us that greatness is not just measured in the scale of one's victories, but in the obstacles overcome to achieve them. Alexander fought the Saka while sick, while his empire burned in revolt behind him, and while suffering the psychological blow of a major defeat. A lesser commander would have retreated, consolidated, and accepted limited objectives. Alexander chose to attack, to meet every challenge head-on, and to turn his darkest hour into yet another legendary victory. That choice, that refusal to accept limits or acknowledge defeat, was what made him not just a great general, but Alexander the Great. So, what do you think? Was Alexander's decision to fight the Sarka while dealing with the Sogdian revolt a brilliant strategic move, or a reckless gamble that could have ended in disaster? I'd love to read your analysis in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey to the edge of the ancient world, please like the video and ensure you are subscribed. And if you want to help support the research for our next documentary, you can now buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. The link is just below. Until next time, remember, history comes alive for those who seek it. See you in the next one.